Today's discussion, we're going to talk about the rise of the Frankish kingdom during the early Middle Ages, as well as some other groups emerging, and the main economic and social system of the time period. About Charlemagne, the Carolingian Renaissance, it was called, the Treaty of Verdun, they're called the Magyars, the Vikings with Leif Erikson, feudalism, and serfdom. Or Charlemagne goes back to Charles Martel. Remember from our previous discussions, he was the hero of the Franks at the Battle of Tours in 732, which he repelled the Muslim attack coming up north from Spain and kept France safe for Christianity. Well, among the other things, Battle of Tours in 732, Martel was the mayor of the palace. Basically, the job of the mayor of the palace is he's head of the household, make sure all the staff are doing all their jobs, and basically the nearest equivalent in America today would be probably chief of staff. Close advisors to the king, running the palace, making sure everything's done, everyone's doing their job correctly. Well, he was a mayor of the palace under the Merovingian dynasty. A group of kings had taken over and ruled the previous couple of centuries. Particularly this royal palace under this man, Thierry IV, who was king of the Franks from 720 to 737. Well, for his skills, efforts, and loyalty, the Martels were greatly valued by the Merovingians. But get some of his successors, not so much. We had Childeric III come in long afterward, king of the Franks from 742 to 752. Martel's son, a man named Pepin the Short. So you've got to love the French. They have the most interesting nicknames for their kings. Pepin the Short was at odds with Childeric III on a number of issues. Basically didn't think he was up to the job. In 752, Pepin overthrows Childeric, establishing himself as king. So he was king of the Franks from 752 till his death in 768. Noble lineage. And with this basically establishes what comes to be known as the Carolingian dynasty. Called as such because of this man, Charlemagne. The king of the Franks, 768 to 814. While the Franks were already a powerful kingdom, Charlemagne made it the greatest empire in Europe in the Middle Ages, having a great rival to the Byzantines, eclipsing in power, but basically the dominant power of Central and Western Europe under the time period. Now, Charlemagne, comes from Latin derivation, Carolus Magnus, which means Charles the Great. See, his given name was Charles, like his grandfather, but Charles in Latin is Carolus Magnus Great. It's whittled down to Charlemagne. As from this Charlemagne, you get, and Carolus Magnus, you get Carolingian. Well, Charlemagne was determined, decisive, very intelligent, very inquisitive, excellent tactician. Very fierce warrior, also a wise patron of learning and a resolute statesman. Greatly expanded the territory of the Frankish kingdom. During his reign of 46 years, he undertook 54 campaigns. Had a small army of 8,000, but gathered at East Spring for campaigning, supplied it, transported it to different areas of kingdoms and beyond the borders. Went out and conquered basically most of Western and Central Europe. In 773, Charlemagne took his army into northern Italy, crushing the Lombards who had seized control of Rome in northern Italy a century earlier. He annexed the Lombard state. His son would be King Louis was crowned as king of Italy, but because Louis was an infant still at this point, 773, Charlemagne really was the one in charge. 4 years after his invasion of Italy, 777, Charlemagne moved his forces into northern Spain. Look at the book on page 217, see a statue of Charlemagne. See the expansion of his territories here in 280. Moving into northern Italy, 773. 777, northeastern Spain, an area called the Spanish March. He wasn't able to move outside of northeastern Spain very much, but he was able to kind of cut into Muslim control of Iberia. But the biggest problem was in the mountains there, area between France and Spain, and the Pyrenees. A group called the Basques, who didn't like the Muslims or the French, continually attacked them and harassed them on their campaigns. Especially moved out further east into Central Europe. Conquered the Saxons, which are basically in northwestern Germany. They're between the Elbe and the Rhine. They're taking portions of the Netherlands. But Charlemagne, being a Roman Catholic, believed that the Saxons should also be converted to Christianity. It's never been pushed by the church for a long time. And Charlemagne decided it would be done by force at this point. Well, the Saxons were not Christians, were not going to convert to Christianity either by a missionary or by the military. It took 18 campaigns to subdue the Saxons, not until 804 were the Saxons completely subdued and completely converted. But in southeastern Germany, particularly the area of Bavaria, Charlemagne invaded here in 787 and brought them into his domain fairly easily. Southern and southeastern Germany. They pushed out even further east. These areas contributed towards Slavic peoples all the way out to the Oder River, basically the border between Germany and Poland, large portions of what is now the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, large portions of Croatia, Slovenia, and so forth. Essentially, all Central Europe was either under his control directly or as a tributary state. His attacks against the Slavs and the Avars were brutal. The Avars were completely annihilated by Charlemagne's attacks. Like so, the Empire of Charlemagne be the largest in Europe until the rise of Napoleon in the 19th century, another Frenchman. That would be more than 1,100 years later. Now, to conquer is one thing, to govern is quite another. Not all conquerors have been able to do so. Charlemagne found a way to be able to do it. And see, in the Carolingian dynasty, there was no system of public taxation. So Charlemagne depended on a royal estate, the resources he needed to govern his empire, his own, produce off his own lands, plus the help of nobles in the area. But the administration of the empire outside of the royal palace, so this area, is done by a group of people called counts. Basically, that was their job, to count money. And the areas they controlled where you get the term counting from. Basically, these minor officials who worked for the king, enforced his laws, collected the taxes, and so forth. But more dangerous border districts, you had people called margraves. Basically, counts in the local and the border districts. Because the areas were not quite pacified yet, margraves often had to have a more military role than an ordinary count. But here's the problem, though. These counts end up becoming hereditary offices, and they end up staying in the areas they've grown up in. So they're able to build up a lot of political power, even more power and influence, able to thwart, subvert the will of the king. Well, Charlemagne couldn't have that. He could have these people basically telling him one thing and turn around doing the exact opposite back home, and making themselves so powerful they cannot be replaced. So Charlemagne attempted to limit the power of the counts. He started requiring them to serve outside of their home districts. Basically, couldn't rely on this wealth and power they built up at home. They had to go somewhere else where their only power was that given by the king. They completely depend on the king for their livelihood and even their very lives. Now, officers are made appointed, trying to keep these from becoming dynasties, because the children and grandchildren of one great man are not necessarily going to be any good at something. You'll have various exceptions, but it's not always. Well, as these counts are now serving outside their home districts, Charlemagne created another office called the Missi Dominici. These are, from Latin, this translates to messengers of the Lord King. Basically, their job is to go and check on the counts. Look at their, look at the ledger books, inspect the districts. Basically, make sure that their counts are carrying out their job and carrying out the will of the king, the Missi Dominici, messengers of the Lord King. Now, sometimes these Missi Dominici are actually church officials. I talked about last time. They're the ones who were educated, most educated. Since they're church officials, assumed they could be trusted. Not always, they could. So, because of their education, expertise in so many fields, the Carolingian kings start relying increasingly more and more on church officials for a lot of these offices. Now, it's an improvement. It's still a lot of inefficiencies in the system. And so there are problems within the church as well. A lot of offices weren't being filled, bishoprics and so forth. So, Pepin the Short and Charlemagne started appointing these bishops themselves to the church. and particularly trying to make sure these men, while they serve the church and were qualified to serve the church, remember that they're the ones that gave them the jobs in the first place. Charlemagne's power grew as it is a reputation, prestige for the church, which in the Christian community would cause some consternation on the Byzantine Empire in the southeast, who saw themselves as the protectors of the church, and particularly since they're fighting the Muslims so much, and particularly seeing themselves as the proper successors of the rulers of Europe, since they saw themselves as the successors to the Roman Empire. Well, the influence of Charlemagne in the church grows even more once you have the problems of Pope Leo III. It's Pope from 795 to 816. And in 799, a few people in Rome, a few nobles that got extremely upset with him. They rose up against Pope Leo's authority, overthrew him, and Leo, fearing for safety, ran to Charlemagne's territory, seeking sanctuary. Charlemagne heard his story, what had happened, realized he'd been unjustly thrown out of office, and this is a legitimate pope, a legitimate ruler of the church. So Charlemagne, 799, sent his army to overthrow these usurpers and to place Leo back on the throne as pope. Leo, grateful for Charlemagne's service and his devotion to the church and to him personally, crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor on December 25th, 800. New title for Charlemagne. Essentially crowning him as Emperor of the Romans, but it's crowned by the church, not by an official Roman government. That's kind of says something right here. This is more than 300 years after the fall of Rome. The Roman Empire still has such a hold on the European imagination that they thought they needed someone to come in, restore order, restore power, fill in this political vacuum that still existed, and essentially take charge of Europe. Essentially, Pope Leo is saying Charlemagne is the new Roman emperor. But basically, he's revived the Roman Empire, which was really not exactly what happened. It's a Frankish kingdom, but it just happens to take in the territories of Europe. He does this on Christmas Day, 800. What it ends up doing, though, it's solidifying what had been the status quo. A fusion of Roman, Christian, and Germanic elements, which would be the foundation of European civilization in the Middle Ages, particularly in southern and western Europe. Now, Charlemagne had interest in revived learning, particularly to help him govern his territories, partly stemming from his own intellectual curiosity as well. So, during this reign, he had a period called the Carolingian Renaissance. Not a big Renaissance, big renewal of learning, but kind of a small-scale Renaissance, renewal, reviving interest in learning. Charlemagne is establishing academies to help train counts and royal officials and local officials. Basically, it's oriented more towards the upper classes, the upper classes, but it's interested in trying to revive education anyway, even if it's just temporary, even just at a very small level. But still, though, most of the intellectual efforts would be taking place within the church, although with Charlemagne's backing and support. These kings and these upper class officials in Charlemagne's kingdom most of the educated ones would still be church officials, remain so for centuries beyond this. So even in spite of the Carolingian Empire, for most of the Middle Ages, most of the literate people, there are not very many literate people outside of the church, particularly in Northern Europe. Well, Charlemagne dies in 814, and his son Louis the Pious comes to the throne. King from 814 to 840. Well, Louis is a good man, but he's not really a politician, not a military man. He's most interested in his faith, practicing, strengthening his relationship with God, basically being a good church goer, good defender and supporter of the church, in terms of ruling his kingdom, also ruling his own soul. But because of this, Louis had a lot of problems controlling the Frankish aristocracy. There was his own 4 sons who were constantly fighting among each other. It's not just fist fights among each other, but eventually with their own armies as well, which frustrated him. But he didn't have the type of charisma or influence, even to influence his own children very much. Frankish kingdom while it still remained largely intact and powerful, Louis the Pious was unable to gain control of the counts anymore, and so kind of worked the system back before even his own grandfather, before Pepin. But now, after Louis's death in 840, you have the 3 surviving sons fighting among each other. One had died by this point. So the 3 surviving sons, Louis the German, as he was called, Charles the Bald, and Lothair, were all fighting for control of the kingdom. Now, Lothair, the oldest son, was one who legally inherited the throne from his father, Louis, ruling from 840 to 855, but still his brothers Louis and Charles are still fighting over it. So this fighting is going forth over years. A huge civil war. It's finally settled in 843, the Treaty of Verdun. And with the Treaty of Verdun, what they do is they go back to an old Frankish tradition. Remember, Frankish tradition was the oldest 3 sons divide up equally the father's inheritance. Basically, they get the father, they've divided by 3. So they're dividing the Charlemagne's kingdom and Louis's kingdom into 3 parts. Lothair, the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and also the Middle Kingdom, it was called. One here, yeah, 225. Essentially, that is eastern France and northern Italy. Louis the German, who would rule from 843 to 876, would have the Eastern Kingdom, basically the Netherlands and Western Germany. And Charles the Bald, going from his death in 877, would have basically Western France and the Spanish March, that is northeastern Spain. That's basically how it would go for many years. Now, the Western Kingdom would kind of have a lot of problems with no building and so forth. Lothair's kingdom, squeezed between the two, was very weak. And eventually the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which went from Charlemagne to Louis to Lothair, eventually goes to Louis the German. And the area that would become Germany was known for many centuries as the Holy Roman Empire. But not France, but Germany. So what ends up happening is two distinct cultures begin to emerge. Here in Charles and Lothair's kingdom, you have this distinctly Frankish kingdom with a lot of Latin influences. But Louis's, it's much more dramatic. Very few Latin influences. Remember, the Romans never really got into those areas. So what ends up happening is you have these distinct Romance languages developing, particularly Italian, Spanish, French, in these areas that had been under control of Lothair and Charles the Bald, and expanding outward. Again, mixture of old Germanic languages with Latin to produce these Romance languages. Not even recognizable barely recognizable by today, but still these would be the beginnings of these languages. You've got a very Germanic kingdom, with old Germanic influences minus the Latin influences merging here will become Germany. But of course, once the situation settles down with the Franks, you have other new groups coming in, particularly the Magyars and the Vikings. Now, the Magyars have moved in from areas basically of Russia into southeastern Europe. They eventually established themselves in the plains of Hungary, and from there made raids in Western Europe. But the defeat at the Battle of Lechfeld in Germany in 955. So their attempt from the late 9th century into the 10th century to try to expand their influence from Hungary is defeated, and end up staying there in Hungary. So, but remember, from the late Roman Empire, the Hun, the Attila the Hun, what happened to them afterward? They ended up settling in the area of Hungary. This combination of the Huns and the Magyars, or have been the Huns, combining to produce Hungary. Muslims had attempted to once again try to attack the Byzantine Empire, staging naval attacks on southern Italy, Crete, Asia Minor, and attempting even Constantinople itself. But these attacks are repelled each time. The Byzantine Empire barely held, but they were severely weakened. And another group called the Vikings. Vikings became the terrors of Europe. The very name Viking sent shivers down the spines of people. The terror. The Vikings were a warrior race. Sought warfare, conquest. In the 9th and 10th centuries, they found it dominating the coasts of Europe. Now, essentially, the Vikings emerged from this area of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Occasionally these are separate kingdoms, occasionally united, different occasions, sometimes all three together, sometimes just Sweden and Denmark, or Denmark and Norway, sometimes Norway and Sweden, but just depending on how the tides portion came along. But the Vikings went by other names, particularly such as the Northmen, Norse, the Norsemen, even the Normans. But again, basically all a variation on Northmen. Remember, Danish and English are very close together, even closer than very close there. The Germanic, English and Danish and German are all Germanic languages. Swedish and Norwegian are Germanic languages. But the Danish is so close to English that for a long time, you could go, in the early Middle Ages, you could go from Denmark to England, they still speak the same language. Except a lot of English words are variations on, have a Danish roots. Now, what sends the Vikings outward? There's some dispute, maybe some overpopulation, maybe more effective monarchs in the region that caused the Vikings kind of rebel against this more stringent controls. But two things are helping the Vikings at this point in the 19th century is they're excellent warriors. They're a military society. They're very good at it. They're also, this time period, they're the best shipbuilders in Europe. No one builds them better. Their long boats were intricately carved from wood. They carried 50 men. See a map of their voyages here on 226. They take these boats, sailing in fleets, go up and down the coast of Europe, raiding coastal villages, up the major rivers, raiding, destroying, burning, pillaging these towns along river banks. Seemed like almost no place safe for the people of Europe at this point. But because there are different groups of Vikings, their culture varies a great deal. There's a group of Swedish Vikings that moved from Sweden and invaded Russia, which basically ended up being the foundation of the kingdom of Russia later on. Modern Russia basically being founded by a combination of Ukrainians ruling from Kiev and Swedish Vikings, creating a very unique culture. But also, Norway, the Norwegian Vikings, they're mostly interested in kind of raiding along the coast of Europe. And so the Danes moving kind of more into Denmark. In fact, there's a large portion of England for years called the Danelaw, after the Danes. But the Vikings came, they conquered, took as much wealth as they could with them, terrorized all of Europe. At one point, it was so bad that the Frankish kings actually gave large portions of their territory, northern France, to the Vikings. And since this territory was for the Norsemen, it came to be called Normandy. It was simply territories for the Vikings, the Norsemen, to rule in northern France. The area is still called Normandy to this day, dating all the way back to the Vikings. It wasn't just northern Europe. The Vikings went wherever they pretty much could sail along Europe. At one point, you actually have the Norman Kingdom of Sicily in the 10th century, 10th and 11th centuries. It is simply all Sicily is given to the Vikings as a tributary state. So they're not leaving any kind of cultural influences in the northern France or in Sicily, but they're collecting a ton of money for a long time off these kingdoms. In fact, the Normans, so this would be their territory for a long time, even though they're not leaving any kind of influence. Basically, the Normans are just there for the money. But they're also explorers as well. By 874, Norwegian Vikings had reached Iceland and conquered it from the Irish. The Irish kings had taken control of this area for a long time, but now they're taking it back. The Vikings are conquering it from the Irish. And they attempted to establish a few colonies there. Actually, these settlements were very thriving, very successful. In fact, for many years, Iceland was under Danish control. It's called Iceland because, actually, while it is mostly plains and farmland, there are a lot of there are a few glaciers there in Iceland, giving it its name. Well, another Viking comes along in 985, a century later, Eric the Red. Redhead, called him because he was redheaded. Eric the Red goes out to even farther and discovers a new land, Greenland. Now, most of Greenland at that time was mostly ice, except for a few small spots along the coast. But basically, he named it Greenland kind of an advertising gimmick. Iceland was named Iceland because of the few glaciers it had, but Greenland, though it's mostly ice, has just enough farmland there that he's able to attract people by calling it Greenland. But the problem for the colonies in Greenland was there was so little territory. They had very little area to farm on. Their production was meek. By the 15th century, these initial colonies had failed. The Danes would kind of take control of it and try to reestablish control over the region, reestablish communities there for many years afterward. But consider Greenland. And you've got, what are these guys here? We've got Europe here. We'll say this is Scandinavia. Denmark here, France, Spain, so forth. We've got England here, roughly. England, Scotland, Ireland, Iceland. So they're reaching Iceland by 874. Then go a little bit further here to Greenland. Just not too far away, kind of hop, skip, and jump over. Well, they've got these colonies here along the coast, and one day this Viking trader is trying to reach his port, gets pushed off course and sails a bit further west. Well, what's west of Greenland? Canada. He's getting all these, discovers a huge land, islands off to the west of Greenland, sails back, tells what's happening, and this inspires Leif Eriksson's son, Leif Erikson, to explore a little further. In Scandinavian languages, there's no apostrophe to indicate possession, just simply double the S, Eric's son, literally. So what you've got here is little islands here, Canada. And so Leif Erikson pushes out further here in 1001 and discovers America, particularly eastern Canada, part of North America. 1001 discovers Baffin Island, huge island off the eastern coast of Canada, what's now called Labrador, and wintered here in this little triangle-shaped island off the coast, which is called today Newfoundland, but he called Vinland. Newfoundland is the English name for that island. It's the Viking name. Leif Erikson's name was Vinland. But he and his men stay here for the winter. A group of Native Americans living there in Newfoundland didn't know what the reputation of Vikings was back in Europe, didn't care. All they saw was people had invaded their land, so they go on the attack, killing Leif Erikson in a raid. But nevertheless, undeterred, the Vikings go all the way back to Norway, report what happened, and over the next 15 years, till about 1015, 1016, the Vikings are trying to colonize Newfoundland. Very nearly succeeded, but they are eventually pushed out by the same attacks that killed Leif Erikson in 1001. So discovered America, at least from the European perspective, the first European there was Leif Erikson. Although the Native Americans had been there for centuries, even millennia before. So by the 11th century, the Vikings kind of fade back into the background a little bit. But what's happening here all over Europe, though, is the rise of something called feudalism. Remember, what happened with these, at the end of the Roman Empire, the early Middle Ages, and you have these refugees fleeing for their lives from rampaging armies and bandits. They sought shelter on these old Roman estates, these large latifundia. And they become part of this tradition, basically this generational debt, that they seek the protection of the lord of the manor, that is, whoever's in charge of it, the landowner, but they have to perform certain services for him each and every year, particularly serving the military, working his fields for his crops and everything, and so forth. Now, at this point in the Middle Ages, lifespans are very short. For men, lifespans are about 40 years. I'm 40 at this point. I'd be over the hill. But 21st century standards, I'm still in the prime of my life. I'd be really at the halfway point of my life expectancy. The lifespan for women, though, is only 30 years old. Basically because such a high infant mortality rate. A lot of women died in childbirth back then. So it's driving down the life expectancy rates. Give an example here of just how this worked out, how different the times are between then and now. In the year 1200, a Sicilian princess, member of the upper class aristocracy, living in Sicily, she's 40 years old. The past life expectancy for most women at that time period, old enough to be a grandmother, probably was a grandmother at this point. She gave birth to a healthy son at the age of 40. It was hailed as a miracle. The family had an audience at the Pope looking at the newborn baby boy. Couldn't be amazing. But here in the 21st century, women 40 years old have children all the time, no problems. But it's something just so rare and unusual at that time period, 1200, that is miraculous. What ends up happening, though, is most of the people end up living here in a system of feudalism. Now, these nobles, they'd be giving titles to nobles, basically nobles and sub-nobles, basically building up this system of hierarchy based on the ownership of the land. But some of these feudal lords are so powerful that it's the kings often having to come to them for military support for their campaigns. The kings having to come to them for support for money. So much so that these nobles could turn down the king. They could do whatever they wanted to, could ignore the king. But it's the Carolingian world that is basically making this system of feudalism possible, and ends up spreading all over Europe, becoming the primary way Europe is run throughout the Middle Ages. Basically, landed nobles controlling the small population, having enough power through land, the money they're earning off their crops and the fields and labor, they can pretty much do whatever they want. So you have very weak kingdoms in many areas because of this. And those working on the lands were called serfs. Basically, the only difference between a serf and a slave was a serf cannot be arbitrarily bought and sold. Not really considered property. You're bound by a generational debt, but you're not really property. But the manorial lord had absolute power over the serfs. Basically, they told them where to live, where to work, told them what they had to pay for their upkeep of, told them what to pay in local taxes to keep the manor running. Basically, they could collect their own taxes. In terms of disputes, they were judge, jury, and executioner. They could kill serfs if they wanted to. They could tell serfs who to marry. In a lot of cases, there are laws saying the serfs could not marry someone off the manor. They say anything they wanted, absolute power over their serfs, its own little mini kingdom. And it became very popular for the manorial lords, obviously because they have all the money, all the power, pretty much ignore anybody else. And by the 9th century, probably about 60% of the population of Western Europe had become serfs. By the height of the Middle Ages, probably about 90% in some areas of Eastern Europe or the population were held in slavery. Overwhelming majority of people held as serfs, basically being held against their will. Because of the safety, security, and these cultural obligations, they pretty much stayed here on the manor their entire lives, generation after generation. And this is a system in which these nobles are building up their power, in which in case they can actually overthrow kings. This keeps the power of keeping kings in check, preventing absolute monarchies from forming in some areas, but actually will end up causing the formation of some representative bodies in the latter part of the Middle Ages, which we'll talk about more next time, the developments of church politics, crusades, and developments among the economy and the society of Europe.